These are the comments Donald Trump had to say. Essentially, this trade war has caused so much damage already.
I think that we will make a deal with China. I think we've had some very good talks, but we will have some very good talks remaining. We're going to make a deal with everybody. And if we don't make a deal, we'll just set a target, and we'll live with that, and it'll be fine too.
How much time?
I would think over the next 3 or 4 weeks. I think maybe the whole thing could be concluded.
This sounds like Trump is tapping out, and we've already seen so much impact from these tariffs that now stand at upwards of 245% on Chinese imports. Dr. Powell, talk about what the real impact has been, and what does it signal that Donald Trump is claiming? He's been begging for calls from Xi Jinping, but he's claiming now that this is all going to get resolved in 3 to 4 weeks, despite the fact that these tariffs are tougher than ever.
Well, the real impact is that it's starting to show the fragility of American supply chains, particularly not only for end consumer products, but importantly also for intermediate goods. So intermediate goods are the products that go into production processes in the United States itself. And over the course of the trade war to date, together with what we anticipate going forward, we're starting to see price rises in intermediate goods, and they're already being passed on down through the supply chain. Let's not forget that the last round of so-called reciprocal tariffs came off the back of tariffs introduced on steel and aluminium, or aluminum, as you folk might like to call it. And we know from historical experience that whilst that might create a bit of a protective veil for upstream industries, the net impact on downstream industries in terms of employment is negative. So we're starting to see what most economists, both orthodox, mainstream, and also heterodox ones, would have anticipated, and consumers in North America are starting to experience a world in which scarcity is going to dominate their lives.
You know, you've been talking a lot about this trade war and how it has backfired so badly on the Trump administration's ultimate goal here. What is that goal, and how has this trade war already backfired in such a rapid time?
To be honest, I don't even know what their ultimate goal was. You know, they said they want to bring manufacturing back to the United States. I don't think that's their goal, because recently during their negotiation with Indonesia, for example, one of the demand by United States is that Indonesia's digital payment system, their mobile payment system, is unfriendly to U.S. credit companies. So they demand Indonesia to switch to MasterCard and Visa system. I mean, this is not about bring manufacturing back to United States, folks. This is about enforcing the U.S. rule on the rest of the world. And I think to much of their surprise, there's a pushback, and the pushback mainly came from China. And what they don't realize is that United States do not have any cards when it comes to China. You know, during the public interviews, they say, "Oh, China needs our money. China needs our market." But the reality is, it's a lot easier to create consumer demand than building a whole industrial supply chain, which took China decades to build, by the way. And, you know, this is not going to happen during the Trump term. This is not going to happen for 5-6 years. This is to really reindustrialize America. This needs to be a long-term, decade-long plan. And we all know U.S. government is not really interested in long-term planning. They're not interested in investing in public infrastructure, education. I mean, all these things that takes time, effort, and that's just beyond the time horizon of the most U.S. politicians, because, you know, they only care about is the next election cycle. And what I think what they did try to do, as kind of been signaled by many social media posts, is they're trying to bring down the bond yield, because U.S., as we all know, has like somewhere up northward of $36 trillion debt, and U.S. do not have the money to repay this debt. So what the U.S. government do is they continue to borrow money to pay off the old debts. And this year, there's about $9 trillion of U.S. Treasury that will become mature. So in order to pay those debts, they have to borrow more money. And what Bison was trying to do, he's trying to crater the stock market. So all the money from the stock market then will flow to safe havens, the U.S. dollar and U.S. bond. That will bring the bond yield down. So his game is, okay, now we can borrow more money, but except at a much lower interest rate. That's his plan to save America. And that did not work because we saw the bond market was broken. The yield has spiked. And this is why they're now capitulating, because their whole plan was in shambles. The problem is Trump's team, people like Bison, who came from a background working at quantum funds by George Soros. He is right now running the country as if he's running a hedge fund. Whereas, before he was just gambling with a retirement fund of teachers, doctors, etc. Now he's gambling with the future of 360 million people in the United States and the world. And his gamble has flopped. And this is why they're panicking right now.
KJ, I'd like you to follow up on that. Could you comment on this? JD Vance recently went viral all over Chinese social media after he called essentially Chinese people peasants when talking about how the U.S.-China trade relationship works. This is what he had to say.
And to make it a little bit more crystal clear, we borrow money from Chinese peasants to buy the things those Chinese peasants manufacture. That is not a recipe for economic prosperity. It's not a recipe for low prices, and it's not a recipe for good jobs in the United States of America. For 40 years, we have gone down that pathway. We've seen closing factories. We've seen rising inflation. We've seen the cost of housing so high that most Americans can't afford to buy a home right now.
JD Vance appears to be laying all of this, KJ, on China, all of these problems, and calling Chinese people peasants. But based on what Carl said, I mean, how is it actually working? How is Donald Trump and the administration's attempt to address these so-called problems they blame on China? How's that going?
Well, certainly it's not working. And there's some very basic reasons for that. They're subscribing to a kind of flat earth theory of economics, largely derived from Peter Navarro. It's a neo-mercantile view or mercantile view of the economy. And their belief is that they need to maintain balance of trade or to have an advantage in their trade surplus vis-a-vis other countries. Of course, this doesn't make any sense from the standpoint of modern economics. We know that there's comparative advantage and that there is win-win relationships that are cultivated through this process of trading under most circumstances. But, just coming back to JD Vance, JD Vance right now is being roasted on Chinese media. And this is also going viral on Western media as well. And they refer to him as the eyeliner guy. And they say, your eyeliner is made in China. And then there's some very, very, humorous tropes where they show him, kind of decked out with smoky eyeliner and going to the max. So they're showing some of the contradictions and the foolishness of this. But coming back to the main point, to blame China. So you can see, rustic country style eyeliner, reliable, made in China, reliable quality. And of course, the point is that, you are getting your look from China, your presentation itself is reliant on China. So China is not easily replaceable. As Carl has pointed out, China's trade surplus with China involves money. Money is fungible. You can replace money. But on the other hand, goods, especially the kind of goods that you get from China, intermediary and as well as finished goods, are not easy to replace, certainly not at the price point and the quality and the quantity that is usually imported at. And so I think they're pointing out very clearly that the U.S. is in very much a weakened position. It does not have the strength. And there's a bunch of, let's say, shall we say, fallacies that are circulating. One is that, that the consumers, one is that China will pay the tariffs. Of course not. It's the consumers will pay, and that will result in inflation. The other is that China is the weaker party in this transaction. Certainly it isn't. For every dollar that China loses in trade, the US will lose 7, according to Nassim Taleb. I think those calculations are pretty valid. And then, of course, this notion that that tariffs will solve anything for us, that they will reindustrialize, or that they will lower prices, or that they will offset a trade deficit. They will actually increase the trade deficit, in my estimation, or that they give the US any kind of negotiating power. I think that's not going to happen. I think the other very relevant meme that is circulating is the guy who is saying that you don't need tariffs. What you need is a revolution. And I think that's a pretty fair statement to make.
A lot of what has been framed here with regard to these tariffs from the United States side, from the Trump administration side, has been no one can compete with the United States. The United States doesn't need China. China needs the United States. From the outset of these tariffs, even as Trump has kept them on China and raised them, he already started to backtrack on things like electronics, and now is saying he's talking to China. I've heard that it's only there are no talks related to tariffs or anything like this, just a standard context. But at the same time, the issue seems to be that Donald Trump is saying, well, we're going to end these, we're going to come to a deal as soon as possible. That doesn't sound like a country and a leadership that is very confident in its position vis-a-vis these tariffs.
The reality is that over the course of the last 30 years or so, the importance of the American market to both China and also to the global economy has diminished in relative terms. These days, the United States market contributes about 14% or thereabouts of global imports, and it's actually about the same for Chinese trade as well. Compare that to only 25 years ago, it was almost double that. So what that means, because the American economy hasn't shrunk, by the way, in that time, but what that means is that trade from all the other parts of the world has been growing faster than trade with the United States. Many of your viewers will have seen the maps that have been circulating in social media, which shows trading relationships circa 1991 or whatever it is to circa 2023. And you'll see a lot of blue in the early days when most countries were trading with the United States. And the later maps show that countries now have a dominant trading relationship with China. So that's the first thing to bear in mind, is that the US market is actually no longer as important as it once was. The second thing to bear in mind is that the transformation that this speaks to also highlights the growing interconnectedness of economic supply chains globally. And what in theory that should do is, yes, that's it. So what in theory that should do is compel countries to find ways in which they better coordinate and better collaborate, because they become far more interdependent. But this idea of interdependence has been loaded up politically, where it's moved from being a sensible economic division of labor proposition to being one in which it's all about power and who controls whom. And that undermines the sort of rationality of supply chain optimization, which ultimately is about being able to deliver the best products at the best price with the least use of energy around the world. Now, untangling all of that, because these supply chains have taken 20, 30 years to mature, and untangling all of that is actually incredibly difficult, not just for the supply side, but as Carl says, it is actually easier to build new markets than it is to reconfigure production systems. But as you start to reconfigure production systems, the time and effort involved in all of that, of course, is real. But the real problems is downstream in the short term, where, for instance, in the United States, businesses will actually end up with a shortage of inputs to make the things that they make for their own consumers, and the prices will rise. Now, there's a second round effect. So the first round effect is some inflation, right? But the second round effect is as buyers start to pull back on what they can and can't afford because of inflation, we actually start to drive a reduction in output. So we have both inflation and reduced output, and we call that stagflation. And the risk at the moment for the United States is that sometime towards the latter end of this year, unless circumstances change dramatically, it is likely to be entering into the early stages of stagflation, where we will have rising unemployment, reduced output, and at the same time, persistent high prices. What that will do in a social and political sense, I don't know. I mean, it depends who you talk to as far as whether or not people will rise up in protest or will have other forms of reaction, such as the expansion of the drug problems, homelessness, and other forms of social anomie that have tended to emerge in the United States as more and more people have been left out of the mainstream economy. So these are the sorts of things. Now, in terms of President Trump's timeframes, well, before the election, he promised to resolve the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. There have been many promises made about how quick things can be done and how easy it will be to resolve complex problems. And unfortunately, none of them have come true. And I suspect that on this set of issues in relation to trade, and global financial architecture, promises of rapid resolutions won't come true either. And I guess the evidence of that isn't only what Carl mentioned, which is that there isn't a clear sense of what the purpose of these policies are, but we see that in the lack of detailed knowledge of the negotiating teams as to what it is that the US actually wants of others, let alone what it wants to establish itself. The recent meetings with the Japanese delegation showed that, and the American side asked the Japanese side, the Japanese side asked the American side, what is it that you want? And the response from the administration was, well, what's your offer? You're the one who's created the disruptions. You clearly have something that you have in mind. But unfortunately, from the US's point of view, there was actually no clear negotiating frame as to what it is that they wanted to achieve. What is the end outcome, both at a bilateral level, but also at a multilateral level? And when you have an environment where the administration is in effect at sixes and sevens, or is all at sea, the uncertainties that creates all around for countries and enterprises across the globe really means that the United States is presenting itself increasingly as an unreliable counterparty, and one in which anyone sensible would steer a wide berth from for the time being.
Right now, to respond to what Dr. Powell is saying, this is art of the deal, folks, right? To keep your opponent off balance. They can never guess what we want when we don't know what we want. And what happened right now some people did an estimation of how long it takes to negotiate a trade deal, and traditionally it takes years, definitely more than 12 months. And what Trump is claiming he's going to do, he's going to negotiate in deals in weeks. That's not going to happen. Weeks, they just started talking. And right now, I'm still not sure what they want, actually, because they said they want to reindustrialize America. But a lot of the thing they're doing is not very conducive to bring manufacturing back home, right? For example, right now, a lot of the American firms actually depends on parts and components from China to manufacture their goods. They're going to getting hit really hard right now. And then they say they want to reduce the trade deficit. Well, they're not selling China anything China wants to buy. China was at one point was importing $350 billion worth of semiconductors, more than they pay for importing oil. And United States said, no, I'm sorry, you can't buy our chips. You can't, they just roll out additional ban on NVIDIA's GPU chip export to China. No, China is the biggest market for NVIDIA, and they just cut off NVIDIA at the knee. And this is why NVIDIA head Jensen Huang just went to Beijing, during this such sensitive time. He went to Beijing to reassure, like, yes, we are with China. We want to be in China. Our firm grow up in China with the Chinese demand. So everyone is, and this is one reason Trump administration is starting to backtracking, because before they put the exemption on electronics, that would have the tariff would have killed Apple. Right, I mean, all the Apple iPhones that's coming from China is going to get slapped with 145% tariff, and this is also a problem with the way they look at the U.S.-China trade. For example, as Warwick has pointed out, they're looking at with a 19th century mercantilist point of view. When they just look at what goods is coming out, what goods going in, but with today's world, everything is so interlinked. For example, the iPhones are made in China. When the iPhones are exported from China to United States, the value of the iPhone is counted toward China's trade surplus. But as we know, China only actually capture a very small part of the iPhone value chain. China makes about $60 out of every iPhone. It's Apple that captures the most of the profit, but of course the problem is this profit is not U.S. trade problem with China is really a distribution problem. Like multinationals like Apple, they're raking in billions in China, but that money goes to like Apple shareholders and Apple employees. Vast majority of Americans who are losing manufacturing jobs, they're not seeing the trickle-down effect, right? So this is where the anger comes from. But Trump is trying to leverage that anger and blame it on China. But of course, everyone is saying, oh, how China took unfair advantage of United States. Like, what are you talking about? Chinese people work hard at the factory, they made a good, and you bought it. This is literally fair trade. How can you say that somehow they took advantage by working long hours at the assembly line, right? I mean, this is just they're just trying to shift the blame for what the Wall Street has done to United States for the last 50 years, which is hollowing out its manufacturing base to chase higher profit margins and cheaper labor costs. But right now, to reverse that process, it takes time. You need to upgrade your workforce skills through education. You need to improve your public infrastructure. These are all the things that China has done in the last 40 years. But Trump administration think they can fix everything with a magic bullet that's called tariff. That's not going to work. And we're seeing the result of that is Chinese goods now are have completely stopped coming to United States. The freight traffic out of Port of California virtually got eliminated. Back in if you shift this timeline a few years back, if China had started a trade embargo against the United States, that would be considered an act of war, right? But now it's the United States that's willingly to cut itself off on China. Now we're seeing the results. I mean, I think they vastly overestimated their own position, and now they're just finding out.